Hey guys, so we're back reading Black Marxism. This is going to be a longer video because this section is long, so sit back, relax, you know. But anyways, we're on part 3, which is Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory, chapter 10, C.L.R. James in the Black Radical Tradition. And the section is called Black Radicals in the Metropole. I've been putting this section off because it's so long. I ain't gonna lie to you. Anyways, let's get started and I'm going to try to keep my tangents short because of how long this is. So, anyways, I hope all is well. Black radicals in the Metropole. During these same years, the British Empire's African and Caribbean subjects were not frequent visitors to the Metropole. In actuality, they had much less access to Britain than their Francophone counterparts had to the European continent. Nevertheless, African merchants were frequent visitors to London, and in time, black students from the emerging middle classes or sponsored by missionary societies found their way to the British Isles. Still, many of the figures who would emerge as important ideologues, theorists, and activists in the anti-imperialist movement in the British colonies after World War I and World War II were forced to take rather... Oh my god, I just looked up this word. Circuitous? No. Circuitous? Circuitous. A route or journey longer than the most direct way. Circuitous routes before arriving to Britain. Padmore, like Azikiwe, I think that's how it's pronounced. Forgive me if it's not. Azikiwe of Nigeria, Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, and Pki Semi of South Africa came to Britain from the United States. With its tradition of black colleges and universities, America was a much more hospitable and accessible route to further education, but experience in the metropole was still important. T. Ras Makinen, in parentheses George T. N. Griffith, came from Britain via America and Denmark. A few others, like John Stone, in parentheses Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, spent a number of penurious? It means like a poverty-stricken, low... Hold up. Let me just find it. Penurious, extremely poor or poverty-stricken. Years in the metropole and on the continent caught between colonial officialdom, missionary networks of limited resources, and rather haphazard employment. The administrators of British colonialism, as we have seen, particularly in those colonies where European settlements had occurred, were generally hostile to natives acquiring Western education outside the You know how, like, black people are not allowed to get education type shit? Yeah, that's all up in this bitch. Let me look up how to pronounce that. Auspice, a divine or prophetic token. Auspice, outside the auspices of the missionary schools or much beyond the elementary level. Some blacks in both the 19th and early 20th centuries did make it to Britain for advanced trading or to further pursue professional careers. Usually, the sons of the fledgling colonial middle classes found all over the empire, they remained within the margins of what was expected of them. Among them, however, were such figures as Henry Sylvester Williams of Trinidad, and we discussed him in Du Bois's chapter, already discussed, Harold Moody of Jamaica, T.R. Makinen from British Guyana, Muhammad Ali Doucet from Egypt, and C.L.R. James, all of whom would play prominent roles in black politics in Britain, but who traveled to Britain with at least professional interests in mind. Once there, these experienced some changes of mind, augmenting their original intents or entirely devoting themselves to black liberation. Among their achievements in Britain would be the establishment of newspapers like Muhammad Ali Doucet's, or Deuce? It's D-U-S-E. It's gonna be light outside. African Times and Orient Review where Marcus Garvey received his first introduction to Pan-Africanism. Such publishing presses as Macon's Pan-African Publishing Company, and the founding of a series of social and political organizations, the Afro-West Indian Literary Society in 1900, the Ethiopian Progressive Association in 1906, the Union of Students of African Descent in 1917, the West African Student Union of 1925, and the League of Colored Peoples in 1933. During the interim between the world wars, a few members of the colonial black intelligentsia working in Britain were closely associated with Marxist or communist movements. Padmore, prominent in the Third International until 1933, was to head the Red International of Labor Unions, the RILU, or Profintern, International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, ITUC-NW. Rajani Palme Dutt, an English-born Eurasian who studied at Oxford, would become the leading theoretician of the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, for 40 years. Peter Blackman, a Barbadian who had worked in West Africa as a missionary, would become a prominent spokesman and journalist for the CPGB. He had been preceded by two other Barbadians, Chris Jones of the Colonial Seamen's Association and Arnold Ward. Shapajuri, Shapurji, Saklatvala. I apologize for not saying that correctly. Saklatvala, a physician born in Bombay, who was one of the first two communists standing for parliament to be elected, represented North Battersea in 1922, and of course James, who would be well known as a writer and a speaker for the Trotsky movement. Left politicians such as Willie Gallacher, the communist MP, Frenner Brockway, and Reverend Reginald Sorensen among the left wing of the Labour Party, and in Brockway's instance, the Independent Labour Party, and the independent Reginald Reynolds were all associates of the radical faction of this black intelligentsia in Britain. But just as some events like the worldwide depression of the late 1920s and 1930s would propel some members of this intelligentsia towards the left, others caused them to seriously question the commitment of European radicals, and particularly European communists, to their causes. In the early and middle 1930s, two such events, the Third International's disbanding of the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers in 1933, and the press revelation of the Soviet Union's trade with Italy in war materials during the Italo-Ethiopian War, in contravention to League of Nations sanctions, proved to be critical. In Britain, the most radical black activists generally turned towards Pan-Africanism as the form of their political work, while retaining aspects of Marxism for their critique of capitalism and imperialism. I'm so excited when we get to Pan-Africanism, y'all. Let me get a drink of coffee! Yeah. I love coffee. So good. In these early decades of the century, as had been the case for most of the previous century, the significance of the Metropole for colonial black intelligentsia was their interest in preparing for a role in, and for some share of, the empire. Others, for instance, tribal authorities or missionaries, might appear in London seeking official relief from this or that manifestation of greed or injustice on the parts of the colonial administrators or settlers. But for the ambitious, this was entirely a waste of the seat of the empire. For them, as James would testify in his own arrival in Britain, it was often a case of the British intellectual going to Britain. Many, of course, returned to their colonial homelands, particularly those from West Africa and the more populous islands of the Caribbean. But quite a few remained in England for the rest of their lives. And as the century proceeded, their numbers were substantially, if intermittently augmented by the arrivals of blacks with peasant and urban working class backgrounds, propelled towards the metropole by the more chaotic forces that catalyzed or were the results of the crises in the world system, that is, war and labor shortages. Ugh, I have a crick in my neck. Finally, a smaller number of these blacks, but certainly the most prominent, came to the Western metropoles to pursue careers in sports and entertainment, careers that would be certainly delimited, if not entirely proscribed, in their native ground. In some part, members of the black intelligentsia resident in Britain acted as a mediation for black labor in the metropoles and the colonies. As doctors like Peter Millard, British Guiana, who tended to the needs of the black and white working classes in the industrial ghettos, as barristers as H.S. Williams and Leary Constantine, they often acted in the interests of colonial appellants or were active in civil and welfare rights. Others, like Mackinnon in Manchester and Samuel Opoba, in parentheses, Sam Oko, and Joka of Liverpool, established restaurants and dance clubs for colonial students, seamen and immigrant workers, black and white. Still, others, like Edward G. Sankey, later a Nigerian businessman, acted as scribes and personal counselors. Britain was at the center of gravity. It was the source of authority for the empire, the highest seat of appeal from the sometimes arbitrary ravages of colonial policy and authority. It was the site so persistently and Hold up. What's that word? No. That's not the word I want. Idyllic? No. Yeah. Idyllic. Extremely happy, peaceful, picturesque. It was a site so persistently and idyllically envisioned in the literary and historical text employed in the colonies of schools that ranged the empire, and where they would extend their intellectual and professional attainments and anticipate being permitted to come into their rightful heritage. England was, in short, the natural setting for this British, in fact, what? Sorry, I'm not reading correctly. My eyes are deceiving me. England was, in short, the natural setting for this British, if black, middle class, frustrated at home, as so many of them were by their recognition of the two Englands, the Englands of the colonies and that of the metropoles. The first, they knew, was contradicted by caste-like boundaries or racialist order. The second, they believed, was fair-minded and a virtual meritocracy. That's really interesting. Only a few among them came to Britain for explicitly political purposes. Mackinnon and Padmore did, but such others as Williams, their predecessor, and James, their contemporary, acquired those purposes while living in Britain. Together, they helped to constitute the generation of black intellectuals that, at their historical juncture, presumed or perhaps understood that the project of anti-imperialism had to be centered in the metropole. I was about to go off on a tangent. Look at that. After their time and because of their work, decolonization and black liberation would return to their native lands. Okay. Mackinnon had first come to Britain in 1935. He returned 2 years later and took up residence for 20 years. He was a Pan-Africanist when he arrived and remained so, deserving to be raked along with Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, and Padmore in that movement. Indeed, he was more responsible than anyone else for bringing the movement together at Manchester in 1945 for the 5th Pan-African Congress, the last time many of them would meet as ideologues without power. As a publisher, Makinen had been the first to publish Eric Williams's work and publish some of the writings of Kenyatta and Padmore as well. For Makinen, who had lived for a time in the United States, the center of the British Empire was a most significant platform. He celebrated the contrast between its liberalism and that of his own society in British Guyana. It did not take him long to come to the belief that colonial radicals could depend upon British traditions of free speech and free press in their attack on the British Empire. What was it like to be a black man in the Britain of the 1930s? Certainly, we were not rich, far from it, but we were generally happy in our lot, just to know that we were challenging one of the greatest empires in the world. Imagine what it meant for us to go to Hyde Park to speak to a race of people who were considered our masters and tell them right out what we felt about their empire and about them. Write any track we wanted to, make terrible speeches, all this when you knew very well that back in the colonies, even to say God is love might get the authorities after you. Persistently, anti-communist throughout his life, a man who could and did beseech his brothers, if you're interested in communism, then buy the book. Don't join the club. That's low-key funny. Makinen could still appreciate the leveling in British political life that minimized national groups and negated the Negro problem that he had experienced as so prevalent in America. The few West Indians, West Africans, or Somalis who worked in the ports or in London were certainly living under terrible conditions, but they were not different from those of the Welsh miner or the appalling areas of the Glasgow slums. We were able to see the worker, the struggle of the proletariat, much more clearly than across the Atlantic. Okay, not too much. Let's keep going. More important to him, the same sort of solidarity was true of blacks. Because blacks were so few in Britain, he believed kinship overrode class. Unlike America, where a pretentious urban black middle class I have stuff to say, but I'm just gonna put a pin in it. Where's my pen? N-I-G-Y. We're going to come back during the discussion to talk about this pretentious urban middle class. Okay, listen. Unlike America, where pretentious urban black middle class had become alienated from the majority of working class blacks, those in pre-World War II Britain formed a responsive fraternity. When in England, some of them became disoriented and went Shenzi? Instead of being disgraced I think it means like crazy. Let's look it up. Savage, barbarous, or uncivilized. That sounds like a... Okay. Instead of being disgraced, we would provide money to pay for their passage home. Harold Moody's League of Colored People and various members of the radical left were also a part of this service network. The most central characteristic of England for Makinen, however, seemed a result of imperial inadvertence. While in Britain, the ruling classes commanded the society by virtue of a certain hegemonic grace, in the colonies, the more brutal machinery of domination persisted. Those blacks who made the journey between these two polarities could never be the same. When you look at the results of those Africans who had been in England, you wouldn't be far wrong in saying that England had been the executioner of its own colonial empire. Importante. In the sense that she had allowed these blacks to feel the contrast between freedom in the metropoles and slavery in the colonies. Hey. Padmore, it seems, despite his vigorous opposition to British imperialism, shared Makinen's enthusiasm for the metropole. He was also impressed by the liberal traditions of what he had learned as a Marxist to identify as bourgeois democracy. The same man, we are told, who in 1931 detailed the exploitation, bloody deeds, and hypocrisy of the empire in Africa and the West Indies, in parentheses, in his the life and struggles of the Negro toiler, and was also capable of exclaiming to Makinen in near reckless admiration. And then here's the quote: the security people, they know we are here. They come into our offices pretending to be buying books or magazines, and sometimes when we are returning from a trip to Russia, they hold us back after crossing the channel. But you can joke with them and say, we've been across to get some Russian gold and we're coming back to enrich the old country. Instead of giving you the American cattle prod treatment, they laugh it off. Oh. Of course, it was all delusion. There was, in the 1930s, little that was quaint or liberal about British politics or generous about the British state. While it was true that in a small niche of British society, the Popular Front and its Third International allies flourished, that radical right... Lord, hold up. Sorry, I got confused. Does that ever happen to you while you're reading? Don't make fun of me. While it was true that in a small niche of British society, the Popular Front and its Third International allies flourished, that radical workers and artists could produce political and literary journals such as Storm, Cambridge Left, The Left Review, New Verse, and others, that such weeklies as the Tribune or Claude Cockburn's The Week could be published, that the Left Book Club could be organized, and drama groups like Unity Theater and the Group Theater could perform, that mass mobilizations like the unemployed of the Jarrow Crusade 1936 would demonstrate, and thousands of volunteers for the Spanish Civil War, for the Spanish Civil War's International Brigade, some 2,762 were thought to have gone to Spain, 1,762 wounded, 543 killed. It was also true that the power in British society was being employed for other things. Girl, when we get into the next book, I am so excited. It's In the Cause of Freedom, Black Radicalism from Harlem to London. It's talking about like the Harlem Renaissance and around that time. From 1917 to 1939. It's so exciting. Where are we at? In the streets, Sir Oswald Mosley's tens of thousands of British Union fascists exacted a terrible physical toll on anti-fascists and destroyed shops like those in London's Mile End Road owned by Jews. Julian Simons recalled, certainly the police force, never notably sympathetic towards left-wing movements, seemed always to assume very readily the task of protecting fascists from opposition. That's really important because that's literally happening right now. Okay. But you can see that pattern. Anyways, keep going. But the official faces of British politics were no less venal. In 1936, at its Edinburgh Conference, the Labour Party had turned its back on the needs of the Republican Spain. and even earlier, the national government embarked on a neutralist course between fascist states and their victims. Yet, the same state had no pretensions towards neutrality where its empire was concerned. Black activists in Britain in the 1930s were subjected to the same heavy manners, as West Indians would say, as their predecessors. Just as in the 1920s, Muhammad Ali Doucet had been constantly trailed by MI5s, by Scotland Yard and agents of the Colonial Office, and Claude McKay, listed in the files of the British Secret Service, was prevented from returning to Jamaica decades after his single year, 1919 to 1921, of radical journalism in England. Oh! British intelligence and the Colonial Office had taken note of Padmore as early as 1931 and proceeded to neutralize his work in Africa. In the Caribbean, particularly during the workers' strikes of 1937 and 38, Black activism was ruthlessly suppressed. And when the Second World War followed, many of these subversives, were duly interned. But the delusion of liberalism, of which Mackinnon and Padmore spoke, was also self-delusion, a piece of a larger misconception. To them and many of their fellows, England and the Second England, the meritocratic England of romance novels and Whig histories, was the embodiment of fair play and deep moral regulation. Girl, please. It was an ideal, then, that even the most committed anti-imperialists among them found difficult to shake. Not even the gross imperfections and racism they confronted in the Metropole dissuaded them. It was as though they had come to accept that as Black Englishmen, a part of their political mission was to correct the errant motherland. Of all of them, it was James who would come closest to understanding why this was so. Doubtlessly, it was his comprehension of English society that provided him with insight into British imperialism, British liberalism, and the British left. On this score, he would proceed far beyond the economism of Engels, Marx, and many of the most recent British Marxists. Do you say the or the? How many more pages? Okay. Sorry, I was laying on it. Perhaps one reason for James's less euphoric reaction to English society was that his introduction to the country had differed in important ways from those of Mackinnon and Padmore. Why does that? I look a little bit weird right now. Living in Lancashire, with Leary and Norma Constantine, physically remote from the more typical sites of middle-class radicalism and organized politics, James was enveloped by a more contemplative work and more mundane politics. Though through Constantine, to be sure, he had gained access to the Manchester Guardian and was soon substituting for Neville Cardis, the paper's cricket correspondent. But his major preoccupations, the collaboration with Constantine on Cricket and I, the public lectures on the West Indies, the editing of the life of Captain Caprini, provided him the opportunity to read Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, to review the lie of labor politics in Britain, and to meet with British workers for discussions removed from the superheated circumstances. Indeed, he would later admit that the development of his critical stance regarding the Labour Party, with which he had identified as Caprinian nationalist, was due to the discussions with Lancashire workers that brought discredit on the party's leadership. In quotation, my labor and socialist ideas have been got from books and were rather abstract. These humorously cynical working men were a revelation and brought me down to earth. Apparently sharing their disillusionment with the Labour Party, he soon found an alternative. And this is the next quotation. I read the history of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky, because I was very much interested in history, and the book seemed to offer some analysis of modern society. At the end of the reading of the book, spring 1934, I became a Trotskyist in my mind and later joined. It was clear in my mind that I was not going to be a Stalinist. It was from this political base and ideology that he would write World Revolution, 1917 to 1936, The Rise and Fall of the Communist International in 1937, and translate Boris Souverin's, sorry if I pronounce that incorrectly, Stalin in 1938. It was as a Trotskyist that James would author The Black Jacobin, the work for which he is best known. First published in 1938, this still formidable study of the Haitian and French revolutions and their significant signification for British abolitionism was at one and the same time an analysis of the relationship between the revolutionary masses and leadership and an attempt to establish the historical legacy of African revolutionary struggles. Importante. This is my favorite type of pen. Really good, really good, really good. Oh my god, I was supposed to get some for my papa. Thank you for the reminder. Within the same volume, it is not difficult to unearth a critique of Stalinism, an expression of Trotsky's concept of a permanent revolution, and the elaboration of Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, all constructed upon Marx's extraordinary determination of the primitive, that is, the imperialist accumulation of capital. It was from the beginning recognized as an extraordinary work. We will return to it shortly. However, it was a second turn of consciousness that provided James with the perspective of English society. That development is recounted in Beyond a Boundary, James's most exquisite statement on British imperialism and the development of English bourgeoisie society. Published in 1963, it was a sort of autobiographic study. Sylvia Wynter called it an autosociographical system, ostensibly of the game of cricket. Here, James excavated his interest into English society as a proper member of the English middle class, steeped in the public school code, Ub, Moon, and Gemini. Lord. Sorry. Interessante. Here, James excavated the interest into English society as a proper member of the English middle class, steeped in the public school code. His memory of being a black boy at Queen's Royal College in Trinidad characterized the bourgeois morality and rationalisms to which he and his fellow colonials were introduced. And here's like a quote. Inside the classrooms, the code had little success. Sneaking was taboo, but we lied and cheated without any sense of shame. I know I did. But as soon as we stepped onto the cricket or football field, more particularly the cricket field, all was changed. We learned to obey the umpire's decision without question, however irrational it was. We learned to play with a team, which meant subordinating your personal inclinations and even interests to the good of the whole. We kept a stiff upper lip in that we did not complain about ill fortune. We did not denounce failure, but we tried or hard luck came easily to our lips. We were generous to opponents and What is wrong with my brain? Congratulated them on victories, even when we knew they did not deserve it. On the playing field, we did what ought to be done. Cricket, he writes, became one of his obsessions. He played it, he read about it, and in time we have noted he had came to write about it. In a way, his youth was dominated by the game. Cricket was the means of his introduction into the island's brown middle class. It selected his personal friends, it grounded his perceptions of manhood and judgments he would make of other men, and eventually, through Constantine, it became the reason for his coming to England. His other obsession was literature. This too was an emanation. Oh. I was like, why can't I hear it? Emanation. Abstract but perceptible thing. Okay. For the English bourgeoisie. For James, it had begun with William Makepeace Thackeray. I laughed without satiety. What the heck is that word? Where are you getting these words from? I'm kidding. To make happy. It won't show me. Anyways, at Thackeray's constant jokes and sneer and jibes at the aristocracy and at people in high places. Thackeray, not Marx, bears the heaviest responsibility for me. After that, I think I'm saying his name correctly, but I don't think so at the same time. Thackeray, there was Dickens, George Eliot, and a whole bunch of English novelists, followed by the poets in Matthew Arnold's selection, Shelley, Keats, and Bryan, Milton, and Spencer. I discovered criticism, Hazlitt, Lamb, and Coleridge, Saintsbury, and Ghosts. Burke led me to speeches, Canning, Lord, Burham, and John Wright. That's a quote from his thing. But the two, cricket and English literature, were complements. Each of them, as he would discover in England, were cultural and ideological expressions of the same social order. A bourgeois order grounded in capitalism, systematized in the 19th century by Thomas Arnold's philosophy of the public school, tutored by the moral persuasions of Thomas Hughes, and embodied by the play of W.G. Grace, the cricketer. The game and its place in the social history of England told it all. Almost done. It was created by the yeoman farmer, the gamekeeper, the potter, the tinker, the Nottingham coal miner, the Yorkshire factory hand. These artisans made it, men of hand and eye, rich and idle, young noblemen, and some substantial city people contributed money, organization, and prestige. The class of the population that seems to have contributed least was the class designed to appropriate the game and convert it into a national institution. This was the solid Victorian middle class. It was oh my god, I need chapsticks so bad. It was the accumulating wealth. It had won its first political victory in the Reform Bill in 1832 and would win its second with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. It was on its way. More than most newcomers, it was raw. The Victorian middle classes read Dickinson, loved Dickinson. Read Dickens, loved Dickens, worshipped Dickens, as few writers have been before or since. It was a very bold assumption that they did not understand what Dickens was saying. Dickens saw Victorian England always with the eyes of pre-Victorian. His ideal England was the England of Hazlitt and of Padwick. Man of genius he was. The Victorians were more perspicacious. I'm not even going to look that up. I don't care. Than he was. I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm like, you know what? This is about cricket. Sorry. They were not looking backwards. They wanted a culture, a way of life of their own. They found it symbolized for them in the work of the three men. First, in Thomas Arnold, the famous headmaster of rugby. Secondly, in Thomas Hughes, the author of Tom Brown's School Days. And lastly, in W.G. Grace. These three men, more than all others, created Victorianism, and to leave out Grace is to misconceive the other two. Cricket and football, as organized games, had become the expressions of the artistic instincts of the English rural and artisan classes. Had James had available to him what E.P. Thomas had concurrently what E.P. Thompson was concurrently formulating in the making of the English working class, what might be mistaken for coincidence if if one were not aware that both James and Thompson were Marxist historians, both were responding to the recent experience of profound political disillusionment. For James, his defeat at the hands of Eric Williams upon his return to Trinidad. For Thompson, his resignation from a British Communist Party he reckoned morally and politically comatose by Stalinism, and both were, in Thompson's words, attempting to defend, re-examine, and extend the Marxist tradition at a time of political and theoretical disaster. He would have had no reason to hesitate in assigning this emergence of organized games to the process of working class formation in England. These games, more particularly their origination and their pre-industrial spirit, untainted by any serious corruptions, were one aspect of the cultural mediations constructed by the working classes as a response to the historical processes of capitalist dislocation, expropriation, and deepening alienation. James, however, could only hint a comprehension of that signification. When the common people were not at work, one thing they wanted was organized sports and games. The reflexive logic of his own development drew his attention elsewhere. He focused his analysis on what the games came to signify for the ruling classes, the classes whose capacities for literary and philosophical articulation had done so much to form his own consciousness. For James, the starting point for understanding the English ruling classes and their hegemony over the laboring classes at home and abroad was in the historical parallel he discovered between ancient Greece and 19th and 20th century imperial Britain. Pause. Sorry, I had to get up. Sometimes I can't sit for too long before I get antsy, but this part right here is really interesting, especially in relation to the Olympics, the current Olympics. Girl. Da-da-da-da-da. Sorry, I really had to, I can't sit for too long. Anyways, this part I put notes on because I was like, OMG, the parallels are paralleling. Listen. Listen. It was a natural place for him to begin. He was British and Greco-Roman we are. In both societies, he recognized a relationship that fused power and organized games, an almost fanatical obsession with athletics, cemented, as he wrote of the Greeks, to the assertion of the natural unity of Greek civilization and the consciousness of themselves as separate from the barbarians who surrounded them. Girl. The first recorded date in European history is 1776 BC, the date of the first Olympic Games. The Greek states made unceasing war against one another. Listen to this parallel. I'm sorry, I can't. But when the four yearly games approached, they declared a national truce. The various competitors assembled at Olympia. The games were held, and when these were over, the wars began again. Pause right here. Think about the Olympics right now. Like, there were literal Palestinians at and not to say that the ongoing genocide was stopped, but there were literal Palestinians at the Olympics and Israelis. And like, just notice those patterns. It's just like, okay. To every Greek city and every colony, as far away as Italy, Sicily, Africa, Egypt, and Marseilles. I don't think I said. The envoys went from Olympia with the invitations, and the community sent the representatives and their official deputations. 40,000 pilgrims would assemble, including the most distinguished members of the Greek society. But James insisted the whole spectacle and its apparent but deceptive parallel in British society required closer analysis. Such an inception would reveal the subtle dialectic between culture and the exercise of domination. Listen. The games were not introduced into Greece by the popular democracy. In fact, when the democracy came into power, it lifted another type of celebration, the tragic drama, to a position of eminence to which the games soon took second place. The Olympic Games had been a festival of the feudal aristocracy and the bourgeoisie of Greece. Only the bourgeoisie had the money to stand the expense of the competitors. Only the aristocratic families were in a position to take part in the chariot races. In England, organized sport had been a mass phenomenon, a spontaneous and public creation. And then, just as with land and labor, the rising bourgeoisie had expropriated it for their own purposes. Undisciplined, vulgar, and lacking self-confidence, they had sensed that their reliance on naked force in their persona as expropriators, exploiters, and imperialists would ultimately destroy them if they could not establish to their own satisfaction their right to rule. They wanted a culture, a way of life of their own. Arnold believed in religion and believed in character. Scarcely less powerful in his conception was the role of the intellect. The English ruling classes accepted Arnold's claim and accepted also his methods in general. But with an unerring instinct, they separated from it the cultivation of the intellect and substituted for it organized games, with cricket at the heart of the curriculum. The public school and its regimen of organized games and its athleticism provided them with a way of life. Think about America. How, like, the rise of anti-intellectualism. Also, you know what? We're almost done. This is like the last. This is the last page, so we're almost done. We're just gonna put a pin in it, and we'll come back and discuss it another time. Athleticism was a complex phenomenon at the heart of which was a belief that compulsory competitive team games identified and developed qualities of character that were admirable in themselves and essential for life's long earnest strife. I'm not shitting on athleticism, girl. I was a cheerleader. That is literally a team sport. So don't think that I'm like I'm not shitting on nobody. You know, girl, I was a cheerleader. You know, like okay. I just want to make that clear because I was about to say. So I was like, wait, can my words be taken as a sense of like shitting on people? Maybe. So let me like make that clear. For some 60 years, from 1853 to 1914, this belief dominated not only the public school system, but also those areas of British and imperial society where public school men played the leading roles. By 1900, the original rationale for organized games had been long forgotten, and athleticism had developed into its own ideological justification. Games not only postponed the mental torment of sex, they taught a morality. They developed manliness and toughness without which an expanding empire cannot be run. They encouraged patriotism. They encouraged patriotism as the fierce loyalty to house and school was transferred to regiment and country. No, let me get into it. So you know how like when you talk like okay, think about like any type of game. It's this versus that. One person will win, one person will lose. No, you know what? No, we're almost done. Okay, pin in it. We're going to put a pin in it. Let me just put a little explanation, you know. We'll come back. But that one, I swear to God. Though it might be said, by its ruling class disciplined and trained itself for the more supple and effective exercise of power, James believed such an interpretation was too mechanistic, too much the clever manipulation, too much the literal translation of what Arnold had intended. The psychological expression of the emergent English bourgeoisie had been drawn from the historical and cultural materials within which it had generated. James preferred to see the forms of their hegemony as extracted from a movement of the national culture, a renewal of English life, drawing on the Puritan past, but universal enough to affect other peoples far removed from its origins. This signifies, as so often in any deeply national movement, that it contained elements of universality that went beyond the bounds of the originating nation. It would be, he maintained, the only contribution that English education would make to the general educational ideas of Western civilization. He was not sure, or as clear as he might have been in the company of Thomson, of the process he termed modern civilization. But he did reveal one of his consequences. The English ruling class bourgeoisie at first had required a discipline for themselves, for their own raison d'etre and reproduction. They found their instrument among the cultural goods produced by the working classes. What they extracted or embedded in athleticism were rules of class. Importante. Why did I say it like that? Were rules of class, moral values, and utilitarian rationalism. What they shared in the social spectacle of the games became a part of the sentiment. Became part of the cement that bonded the several social orders into an identical imperial mission, one that would include even those natives at the peripheries whose claims to an English identity would amount to a tragic mistake. In the absence of a more telling evidence, we must surmise that James discovered that mistake in England 30 years before he sat down to write Beyond a Boundary. When James and his contemporaries appeared in the Metropole in the 1920s and 1930s, the England in which they had been immersed had already passed. Indeed, except in the airy fantasies manufactured by the ruling class and their intelligentsia, it may never have existed. Among these elements that truly made a difference, the working classes were becoming detached from their identification with the bourgeoisie and the nobility. English workers were militantly demonstrating that they were no longer persuaded that their future and that of the ruling classes were identical. Their betrayal of capitalism, manifested in the millions of unemployed, made many for the moment no longer willing to fight imperialist wars. By the mid-1930s, their declared interest could be found in demonstrations like the Hunger March of 1934 and the Jarrow Crusade of 1936, and they formed into militant grassroots groups unlike the National Employed Workers Movement, their numbers swelling even the membership figures of the CPGB. In 1 year, 1935 through 36, the party went from 7,000 to 11,500. The material crises of world capitalism and the political incompetence of the ruling classes, despite the repeated betrayals by the leadership of the Labor Party and the trade union movement, provided a basis for a certain regeneration of the formal working class movement in its electoral aspect. Membership in the trade unions expanded, and the Labor Party, in disgrace in 1931, made substantial gains, as did the CPGB. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's funny to me. In the municipal elections of 1932, 1933, and 1934, and the general election of 1935, the organized left, however, was not a major beneficiary. Hello? For Padmore, Makinen, and their African comrades, I.T.A. Wallace Johnson and Kenyatta, in the anti-imperialist left, there was another difference. Inevitably, even James realized that the illusion of the empire was a global fraternity benevolently orchestrated by advanced races for the interest of backwards one, was at best remote from the actualities that they encountered. Meaning, it's fake. Like, y'all are lying. Like, you're over here, we're gonna civilize them. Really? We're gonna bring democracy. Are you really? 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 Please. Anyways, England, with its ever-broadening, grubby, dark poverty, its low-life fascists actively aligned and identified with factions of the ruling classes, its vulgar displays of racism, which inexplicably victimized those among the colonials who were the proudest of being English, and its political mediocrity inspired contempt, not confidence. The sheer pettiness of political discourse and bureaucratic can't betray what was once expected from the English heritage or even from a respected enemy. These were not the actions of pretentious colonial administrators. They were the manifestations in the home country itself. And while revolutionary movements of grandeur, scale, and vision could be seen emerging from among backwards peoples in India, Ceylon, Seylon, China, and Africa, while even the Japanese ruling classes were mounting a massive territorial empire and the Soviets rationalizing one, the left in Britain displayed characteristic factionalism, ideological toadyism, and a politics dishonorably distant from the working classes and their struggles. Abandoned, as Padmore believed, by their most powerful ally, the world communist movement, thoroughly disgusted with the duplicity of imperial policy, they turned towards the black radical tradition. Yay! That one was long. I really appreciate you sitting here listening to me talk and read this book. And we're done with that section. The next section is the theory of the Black Jacobin. So I will see you in the next video. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, y'all.